right, good morning everyone, and just wanted to say a big thanks to the organising committee and looking forward to seeing the other presentations, a great lineup. My name's Dr. Schouten. I'm a beekeeper and beekeeping researcher at Southern Cross University in Northern New South Wales. We're on Bundjalung country up this way. I'm also the project leader for the Bees for Sustainable Livelihoods Research Group, and we've got active research in the Southeast Asia Pacific region. And particularly at the moment, we've got programs that are funded by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, looking at ways to improve the productivity and profitability of smallholder beekeepers' incomes in Papua New Guinea and Fiji. So I'm going to be talking about international beekeeping research for development today. This is something that I'm really passionate about for a number of reasons. I did my PhD in understanding the mechanisms driving the success and failures of beekeeping for development programs. But I think there's a lot of benefits that beekeeping has to offer. Obviously, we're all aware of some of these, but particularly in a development context in terms of generating income for rural communities without exacerbating environmental degradation. I think we share that passion here in Australia as well as a very mutualistic form of agriculture. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the research outcomes and some of the publications that we put out as a result of this, this research. Just wanted to flag that there's lots of other research activities that are underway. We're only a year and a half into this project at the moment. So it's just some of those research activities, but it's also not just about the research, it's about the uptake of a lot of the findings and economic impacts for beekeepers, expanding their businesses, making more honey, and also their welfare and how happy they are and that sort of thing as well. And it's about capacity building at the same time. So let's dive into some of it. So why beekeeping for development? So bees have a lot more to offer than just honey, as we're all aware of, and I don't need to convince all you crazy bee people about how good bees are, obviously, but there's lots of benefits that might not come to the eyes as easy as others. So beekeeping, you can conduct this on unsuitable or steep slopes or unproductive land. There's significant contributions in terms of pollination services. And you can imagine if you're a smallholder beekeeper, it's really important in terms of, you can significantly increase your crop yields. In regional areas and these rural places where people don't have access to financial services, such as banks and loans, we're finding the research was showing these rural communities are using their sort of honey because it doesn't perish like other crops as a form of a bank. So they can spend that honey money in times of financial hardship and in need. So it's really important in terms of income smoothing. It's non-competitive with other types of resource-intensive agricultural production. And where these communities are generating an income from the forest, they may have an incentive to protect that forest area. And these are often of really high conservation biodiversity values. So because of all these benefits that beekeeping has to offer, we're seeing lots of international aid programs getting excited about beekeeping. But a lot of these programs also seem to think that you can just put bees out in a paddock and they're going to be healthy and happy and produce you lots of honey, which is just not the case. The research we're doing is showing that if you give about 100 beekeepers some hives, give a bit of them a training, in about 3 years, if you come back, you'd be lucky to have 15% of those beekeepers still operating. So attrition amongst beekeeping adopters is a chronic problem. Colony losses are quite high. Support for and coordination of the sector is low, and the practices and production amongst beekeeping is often pretty inefficient. So this afternoon at about 2:40, I'm going to be talking about the 5 pillars for beekeeping for development. They are education, extension, nutrition, pests and diseases, genetics, and technology. So I'm going to be going into a bit more of a discussion on that. And really not just doing more of these programs, but how to improve the effectiveness and impact for these communities and the people that we're developing this research for. And a lot of the research that we're conducting overseas too also has a lot of outcomes for our Australian industry here in terms of our understanding of educational extension services, of bee biosecurity and capacity building amongst the team to be able to identify, manage and monitor pests and diseases in our nearest neighbouring countries. So this is an article that we put out recently. Obviously, COVID-19's got in the way of a fair bit of travel. This is a scoping review. So it started with 3,300 articles. These got screened down to about 50 from 19 low and middle income countries, and it involved about 4,700 participants. Specifically looking at operations, looking at Apis mellifera, Langstroth hives. So obviously, there's other bees going on in these spaces as well. So what we found is, as you can imagine, beekeepers own very few colonies, only about 20 on average in these countries. But what's important to note is this is actually accounting for 29% on average for their annual cash earnings. So not many hives, but a very important contribution to their income. And what we were looking for in some of these articles, amongst lots of other descriptive statistics and interesting information, were some of the factors that are influencing beekeepers' incomes and their honey yield. So we found 15 different factors, and obviously there's different studies using different methodologies to, some of them are better than others, obviously. But you can see here in this graph that in the dark bars, these were predictors that were significantly influencing beekeepers' incomes or honey yield. So obviously with increasing number of beehives, you're going to have more income from beekeeping. So that makes sense. Interestingly, though, if you think about it, participation in cooperatives or setting up honey cooperatives, there's not a lot of literature in these countries to suggest that that's a strategy that could actually be beneficial for beekeepers. And in some cases, you can see some of these factors that have both positive and potentially negative outcomes or no influence. So one interesting one, for example, is beekeeping training days, which we'll touch more on in this talk, is that you would imagine that there would be a relationship between, getting more understanding and building your skills in beekeeping. So the number of days that you go to training and extension visits, that would have an influence in your beekeeping operations. So another thing to point out here too is it's just sort of about identifying what are those key factors that are influencing beekeepers' incomes and yields, but also it was a bit of a worry to see that in a lot of these articles, profitability isn't really highlighted, in that a lot of these studies, in fact, only one of them was reporting on labor and time inputs. And I think that's something, even for my beekeeping operation, I'd like to pay myself $30 an hour. I'm my own boss in that, but it's important that when I look at how much of a profit I'm making in my business, that I'm putting that labor cost in there as well, trying to work out how much it costs me to make a kilo of honey. So yeah, there's time and labor inputs, and also in terms of people's welfare. So going beyond numbers of hives as a measurable indicator of success, and saying, how sustainable is this enterprise? How resilient is it to environmental shocks and market trends and changes? And how do people enjoy this enterprise and that sort of thing? So one thing I didn't just touch on that last slide was that what we didn't find in that Schouten review is there was no relationship between training, and outcomes of beekeeping. So there was some studies that were showing both. So we kind of had a look at this in Papua New Guinea. This is a study where we interviewed 120 beekeepers, had lots of really important industry descriptive statistics in terms of developing reports that then the government agencies and NGOs can also report up to demonstrate the value of the industry to the sector there. We were finding that 85% of participants were showing that they use their honey and their beehives as a form of a bank, and that acts as security in times of financial hardship was really important. There's also sort of describing what contributions in terms of cash income, so about $715 annually US for these beekeepers in PNG. And this is really important contribution in terms of, in the context where these people are only earning about 1,000 US a year. So what we try to identify was some predictors of their 5-year average beekeeping incomes, honey yields, and number of hive zones. This is an average over 5 years. So what we found was that beekeeping experience is significantly correlated with their cash income from beekeeping. We found that those beekeepers that owned their land, that had access to honey collection services and knew why and how to supplementary feed bees, that was a significant predictor of their honey yields. Owning protective equipment like gloves and veils and the ability to make colony splits was a predictor of how many colonies they had. And owning more than a single apiary site and mentioning interest as a reason for starting beekeeping were significant predictors of honey production, numbers of beehives, and their cash income from beekeeping. So that's really interesting finding there. But what we didn't find in PNG was a relationship between the number of training days that beekeepers had attended, the number of extension visits they'd had, and their income. And that's a bit concerning, considering that the ability to make colony splits and knowing why and how to supplementary feed bees is a significant predictor of the number of beehives they have and their honey yields. So just moving on from that, leading into a different study that we conducted. This is in Fiji. We got all our beekeeping extension agents and trainers together. This is something that we could benefit from here too in Australia. I'd love to participate. Would be to get all your beekeeping trainers together to give peer-to-peer feedback on a theoretical concept and also a practical demonstration on how you could improve, identify educational extension materials that are important to them, and what can be developed. Well, it's interesting to find here that we say there's all these other benefits of beekeeping, but there's all these other additional income streams that are not often looked at. And we found that income from beekeeping training accounted for about 18% of annual cash earnings, which is a really significant contribution considering that their total incomes, the median was around 8,000 Australian dollars. So a really important source of income, and also spending quite little time developing that as those training days, if that makes sense, in comparison to the amount of time that they spend beekeeping. So this article looks at a whole range of different factors that were found to limit the effectiveness of beekeeping training. Don't have a lot of time to go into all of those different topics, excuse me, but feel free to jump online and have a look at some of those. Some of them might be what you've already experienced if you're involved in any education, extension, outreach elements, but I think it can also be important as researchers as well, and when we're communicating our findings to industry. So there's a number of different points I'd like to highlight in there. Not only the things that limit the effectiveness of beekeeping education, extension, training, but also some factors that can really enhance it. So just to sort of summarize, it's about focusing on practical skills and those core skills that are going to enable beekeepers to generate income. So how to find a queen bee, how to light a smoker, how to harvest honey, how to identify and manage those core pest and disease problems and things like that. And really ensuring that training is outcome-based. So handing over the hive tool, making sure that people don't get a certificate of competency until they can actually demonstrate that they've got that skill. So there's a whole range of different benefits of beekeeping training there, and just some tips for improving the education and extension in that article. So I'm just going to go over briefly a couple of articles really quickly that we produced in the project that we're involved in. I'm not going to discuss them really in much detail. I'm just going to whiz over some of them just so that you know some of them that are out there. This is a master's student of mine, Jordana Hinton. She's been looking at some financial services in supporting beekeeping enterprises. I work with Dr. John Roberts at the CSIRO and PNG, developing some methods for managing tropolaelaps and varroa mites using non-chemical controls, and also evaluating the effectiveness of the current methods. We've got my PhD candidate, Annalise Austin, is going to be presenting this afternoon at looking at getting youth and women more involved along the honey value chain. So feel free to have a look at that article and join in for a presentation this afternoon. And another one, which is drawing on 52 participants, 750 years of collective experience in beekeeping for development programs, and discussing the perceived determinants underpinning the success and failure of some of these programs. So that's a bit of an overview of some of the research that we've been involved in. Sorry, it's all a bit rushed over, but just wanted to be a bit of aware about some of the scope of the research we're involved in, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Looking forward to seeing you, and happy beekeeping.